Hey, you're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, and on each episode, I invite not one, but two guests to join me for a conversation-style interview. These are smart, funny, usually a little eccentric, frequently a little weird, often very online friends of mine, and even if you don't understand what they have in common at first, just wait, because I've seen some common ground between them that I've been dying to ask them about, and just press record. The show practically named itself, seriously. So subscribe, like, comment below, and stick around at the end of the disclosures, disclaimers, and reminders, and, come find me, cultishcreative.com, at cultishcreative on Twitter, and by name on LinkedIn. Without further ado, throw your seatbelts on. Let's make it a record. Okay, I am pressing record now. You're watching Just Press Record. This is the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I've got special guests for you today. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, proving anybody can talk to anyone if they're just curious enough. I'm going to invite you to get curious about these two people with me. Now, my first guest, one of my favorite Hals. And in case you're wondering, no, it's not Halliburton, even if he's busy fixing the refineries of psychology and business. And it's not Hal 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey. He's not AI, but he is artificially intelligent, as you get, with the TED Talks and books and podcasts, appearances, and everything else to prove it. And he's not Hal Wilkerson, that semi-lovable Walter White kind of Breaking Bad dad from Malcolm in the Middle. Side note, I'd love to unpack that connection with you someday, possibly not today, but really into that. No. So this is my number one Hal, the future self-researcher himself, UCLA Anderson School of Management's own Mr. Hal Hershfield. Welcome to the show, Hal.
Thank you, Matt. I've never been compared to so many Hals before. I like it.
Well, we need, Hals are hard, but this next guest, I'll almost there's so many of these on the cutting room floor. I'm embarrassed. I can send you a list later, but it's one of my favorite Julias, and not Julia Childs, but this Julia's always got something new cooking. It's not Julia Louis-Dreyfus, but she certainly has had the title of Veep before, and probably at more than one Fortune 500 company. And most of all, she's definitely not Julia Gulia, who never even achieved that name in The Wedding Singer, I don't think, but I know she's a music and pop culture nerd, so I hope she appreciates a good Julia Gulia reference as much as I do. One of my favorite leadership voices on LinkedIn and in the future of the finance industry and the tech that we use and everything else. It's Julia Carreon. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thanks for having me. I'm a very good cook, so thank you for the Julia Child comparison.
I had to make sure I got at least a music reference. And
the Indonesian version.
Fantastic. Well, you guys, so correct me if I'm wrong, nod your head, say yes or no. You guys have never met before, right? This is genuinely a good Barstool conversation here.
Yeah, we're technically connected on LinkedIn. So I just to be fully transparent, right? But we've never met before.
Awesome. Well, I want to start with this, and Hal, I'm putting you completely on the spot with this, but I think you'll remember this one. You tell this great story about sitting in a conference and a question about if you were going to be a vampire the next day. Do you know what story I'm talking about?
I do.
Ringing a bell? Can you tell the story of just being asked that question? And then we're going to ask Julia the same question before you give away your answer, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. So I was at this conference and it was in Iceland, which feels important because most conferences aren't in such cool places. And I'll admit I was bored out of my mind. And my wife was there too. And she was traipsing all over Iceland. And I was feeling intensely jealous that I was sitting in a conference room. And this philosopher, L.A. Paul from Yale, she gets up and she goes, imagine you got a one-time offer to become a vampire. And I was like, all right, now I'm going to listen. And she's like, here's the deal. All your friends have become vampires. And they say you're going to love it. We know you'll love it because you like wearing black clothes and you like staying up late at night and you have exotic food preferences. We think you're going to love this. The only catch is that once you become a vampire, you can't undo it. And that is a decision that you'll make. And by the way, once you become a vampire, you can't know what your preferences will be because now you're turning into a new version of yourself. So that was the question.
Julia, if you were going to be a vampire tomorrow, yes or no, are you taking it? What do you think of this question? How's this hit you?
This question is so strange. I'm really wondering, what am I doing here on this podcast, Matt? No, seriously. Yes or no, I'm going to say no.
Hal, did she answer correctly? What do you think about this?
I
I don't know
mean,
what
I
to
don't
tell
know
what
if
the
there's a
metaphor was.
I don't think it is.
I'm saying no. I watched True Blood. I'm scared of this stuff. I read Bram Stoker. Like, I'm good with it. What are you saying, Hal?
Should I tell you the panic attack I had while I was weighing this question or no?
Yes, we
So
need to hear it.
I'm sitting there in the room and Julia, we had just found out my wife was pregnant like 4 days before.
Oh,
And this professor was talking all about this. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so weird. Like, I kind of feel like this is a little like becoming a parent. Like all your friends are doing it. They say you like it, but you don't know what it's like until you do it. And you can't undo it once you become it. And I'm like, my heart's like beating in the back of the room. And at that moment, the professor goes, of course, this is just an analogy to becoming a parent. And she's like, it's really an analogy to doing anything transformational in your life. You don't know what it's like until you jump in and do it. I didn't necessarily leave the room in a panic, but I certainly started sweating.
so can I tell you why I love this? I love this because I didn't have kids until my mid-30s and I had my last child at 41 and
Oh.
I wasn't excited about it. And my oldest son goes to college on Monday.
Wow.
And and so the whole journey of doing this whole thing called parenting and then being a weeping puddle thinking about him leaving when for decades I'm like, when are you getting out of my house? I love this. This is the best.
That's fantastic.
Perfect timing.
And Julia, like, so part of why I want Hal to start with that story, I'm thrilled that you never heard this before, is because that whole big giant life change, like forever, there's no going back thing. You talk about a lot of this in your own work and your own writing and the leadership that you've done for decades. You've been this like hidden name inside of the advice and banking and finance industry. But I know you've looked at this and gone like, there's no going back after you cross this chasm. How do you help explain that to people when there's this giant chasm to be crossed and it feels so intimidating, like becoming a vampire?
Look, I'm going to, my answer is that if you believe in yourself and you understand kind of where your gut biomes are telling you what they're telling you to do, then even if it's scary and even if it isn't the exact same thing that you thought it was going to be, you can always go back to something else, or it is a bridge to something else. And never, ever underestimate what you're going to learn between here and there, because that, I think, is where the beauty lies.
Hal, what is it about the estimation of those things, of what we might learn versus what we will learn, and why it's so friggin' scary?
You know, I love what Julia, I love what you just said. I love the question that you just asked, Matt, because I think you sort of hit the nail on the head why it's so hard for so many people to take that jump, because it feels like, I think part of the feeling is I can't go back. Now, and in some transformational decisions, that's true, right? Like, I think that is true of becoming a parent, right? And certain other ones. But, career-wise, there's certain decisions where like, oh yeah, on some level you can't go back, but like, you also don't know what you don't know what you don't know. And I think you said it really well. Like, how did you say it? You don't know what you're going to learn between here and there.
Yeah, the beauty is in what you learn between here and there. And Hal, you don't know this, and Matt, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and tell you. 3 months ago, I quit a very high profile job at a major firm. I quit the day I was on the NASDAQ. And I jumped into this menopause wellness company that came up as an opportunity because I went through menopause and had a horrible experience and whatever, I won't go there. I started doing that, and I've been doing it for the last 2 months. And I realized that I absolutely hated the idea of building a direct-to-consumer company. I loved the mission. I hated the work. And so just this week, I'm pivoting again. And the number of opportunities that have come up for me and the idea of doing something different, completely different, it's kind of like how I ended up exactly where you said. I'm not going back to like a captive role in a big corporation, but I'm doing something that I never would have had an opportunity to do if I hadn't done the menopause thing in between. And so I just think, if you're open to the possibility of life, then it's going to work out. It's just not going to work out as you thought. And the other thing that's just really important is at the same time, I had turned down what I would have thought was the job of a lifetime at a top 5 investment bank that was recruiting me at the same time I was deciding whether to do the menopause thing or quit corporate. So
Wow.
I never would have joined the menopause thing, and always would have taken the safe bet for the top 5 investment bank. And that would have been the wrong choice. So it all happened, life unfolds for a reason. I'm absolutely sure.
Can I respond to this real fast?
This is why you're here. This is a Barstool
I absolutely
conversation.
love this. Something that you said there. It's funny. Like I forget how you said it, but it's like you wouldn't necessarily be where you are right now had you not done the menopause job.
So,
And like I think that there's a perspective. Like somebody could look at that. Like you might look at that from like if you had painted this picture 10 years ago, you might be like, "What's happening? Something's wrong." Right. And living it and going through it, it's like, no, not at all. Like I've actually learned something and I'm better off. I talk about this, like, this is a very reduced form of this, but like when I do research with my PhD students, sometimes we'll go a path and the study won't work out and they'll be like despondent and they're like, that didn't work. I'm like, no, it didn't work, but we now know something we didn't know then. And now we're on a different path and it's a better one. And it's like, that's like a very like microcosmic analogy for like what you're talking about,
I think it's exactly the same thing. I'd love that. It's so great.
Yeah. This is so cool.
How besides like is it a Ben Franklin quote? There's something about like, your every failure is one step closer. It's like another thing that now actually, even though it's wrong, it's another thing is wrong. So the list got shorter.
That's great. I like that.
Are there any are there any clinical words to describe this thing? Like to describe the misstep?
You know what? This reminds me, I don't know. There's this guy, have you ever heard of this book it's called The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, which is the funniest thing. Basically, this guy is a linguist and he just comes up with words for feelings and experiences that we don't have words for. And I feel like there should be a word for this. Maybe there is, and somebody's going to call it and be like, "You idiot, it's this thing." And if so, like, I stand corrected. I'd love to know it.
How do you think about this trajectory thing of like, I'm looking forward at something that I know I want. I have the chasm in between. And so it's like I enter into that chasm and it almost like, it's like you went closer, but it felt farther away. Like Julia was looking for this career and she thought she was stepping closer to this new career, but then ended up farther away, even though she took a step forward. What the heck is that?
It's an interesting thing. There's research on goal pursuit. And this is like on maybe a smaller scale, because often, if I think about my goal of, I'm going to run, 100 miles between now and 3 months from now or something like that. One of the things we know that happens is your motivation's pretty high at the very beginning because you're starting this new thing. And your motivation is also high at the end because you're like close to the end. And then there's this like drop in the middle. And that's kind of like in a way, it's like the chasm between, this is again, like a reduced form, but it's like, that's the chasm between like where I was and where I'm going. And it's like, you can feel lost there, I think. And also, by the way, like who's to say where I am in my narrative? Like, like Julia, there could be like 6 more changes between now and like whatever a traditional retirement or non-traditional retirement is, or this could be it. Like who knows, right? Like we don't know.
Well, and so Matt, now I don't want to talk too much, but what I love about what Hal just said. Okay, good. All right. Yeah. Well, then I have to say this because when people were asking me about kind of this wild menopause thing that I started talking about, I started talking about menopause simply because it is yet one more way that I have passion for, that the patriarchy is keeping middle-aged women like with their foot on their head, right? The world is like wants us to be quiet and dumpy and miserable and just doing all the hard stuff without doing any other kind of fun stuff. That's kind of my mental model of what happened to me during menopause. So for me, this whole jump was ultimately about my ultimate, where I'm going, Hal, on the other side of that is to be a very strong voice for women in the workplace, taking up space and being heard in a way that seems more fair than it is today. And we can talk about that later. I won't give the example that I want to share. So Hal, to your point, like, this is just one more step to that, right? Which was the goal all along. Yeah. So the next thing that I'm doing might get me there, but maybe not. And guess what? I'm going to be okay. And that's the part that I think people really struggle with is I'm not going to be okay because I walked away from that traditional predictable salary, or I walked away from the safety net of all the people that I knew who used to keep me comfortable. And so shaking things up by throwing yourself into the deep end of the pool can be a scary thing for people. I totally get it.
Yeah. And it can be, right. It absolutely can be scary. And it's also depends on the metric you're using to define success, right? Mm-hmm. So like if success is defined in terms of like, I turned down that big salary at that top 5 job, that's one way to look at it. But if it's success is, am I furthering my big picture, like goal? Or like I have a colleague who calls it the big why. Like, what's the big why that's driving me? You're doing that, and that's, I love that you can say that overarching goal of, encouraging women to take up space at any age in the workforce is exactly what you're furthering right now. And it may look different. The form of it may look different along the way. I think that's really, I think it's a really important and mature way to look at transitions career-wise.
Gosh, Matt, this conversation, I mean, Hal is like the coolest person ever to be talking to this week.
I was doing the same thing. This is so cool. I love that you thought to do this, Matt. Like, I don't even know what you thought about in terms of like, how do I pair up people, but this is awesome.
This is exactly what the goal is. Interesting people have interesting conversations. Just got to put some curiosity on the table. Julia, I got to ask you about this too, though. So I'm really drawn to this. I just want to go straight into it. Like this, when did you know you wanted to take on the patriarchy? Oh God. No, but seriously, like, let's not dance around this. Go take me straight into this. You've been in a male dominated industry, hell bent on a path to both prove your worth, prove your mettle, and get things done. And you've been fighting up this for a long time. That's a totally different focus than just what Hal talked about, or like get the right ruler for, I'm going to make this much money. I'm going to save this much money. I'm going to buy these fancy things or take care of my family in this way. That's a different mission. That's a big statement, what you just said. Most people can't say what you just said.
Well, look, here's the couple things that I want to say. My career would not have been successful. By the way, I'm very bold about the fact that I have had a wildly successful career. I know that I have led teams that have delivered in the top 1% of innovation in wealth management in 18 years. And I feel good that I'm saying that out loud because we did it as a team. So first of all, my career would not be possible without men. And all of the people in my life that lifted me up and was a supporter to me are men. So first of all, it's not about bashing men at all, because the men that are in my life, and by the way, I'm a mother of 3 boys, right? And I'm married to a man, like, I love men. So it's, the patriarchy for me is not personal. It's a construct. And I'm going to give this example, and then I'm going to let Hal and you react, because I think it's really important. How I knew for sure, Matt, is that I was in a review for new managing directors at a firm, and a man who routinely screamed at people in meetings was put up for managing director. Everybody was saying that he was effective. And I was a little voice in the room that said, well, he might be effective, but his how could use work. So let's just leave that conversation right there. I just said that and moved on. An hour later, a woman was put up, very Ivy League educated woman, amazing, got put up for managing director. And they said, she's too wedded to her numbers. Are her numbers incorrect? No, they're always correct. She's intimidating. Oh, why is she intimidating? Well, because she's kind of scary, because she's too firm. She's too, she holds her ground, right? So that, you know what happened at the end? She needs to go to finishing school. That's what they decided. Oh, we're not going to put her up because she needs to polish her style. And here's what I realized. Women are not asking for anything more than a fair shake. But in that example, you see the man who screams is considered effective. The woman who holds her ground is told that she's too much. That's when I realized the chasm between here and there is way too vast in this day and age. And women are not going to get ahead if that chasm doesn't get somewhere in the middle. I am very, very tough at work. I am. I'm not a shrinking violet, but guess what I got painted as? You're difficult. You're too much. You need to tone it down. Well, fine. Say that to the men then. That's all I'm saying. And I don't think people get that that's all women are asking for. Let's talk about the Kamala moment when she scolded the Palestinian, right? It was an amazing moment. Right? Like amazing moment in leadership. So that's, Matt, that's when I was like, you know what? Kind of had enough. Like we are too far away from equality in these moments, right? Especially the more senior you get. Sorry, Hal.
No, I was just going to say, I think what you're talking about is so interesting because, there's so much work in psychology on explicit and implicit attitudes. And, like the difference between explicit sexism and implicit sexism, or explicit racism and implicit racism. And, the like old school explicit sexism of like women are not promoted is a much harder, it's harder to find. Of course, we see those instances out there, but like most people who are dialed in are not going to want to like have their name behind something where there's like an explicit, like these women are not being promoted. But what you're talking about is that like insidious implicit version of the problem. And I think it's, for every one example, like you brought up, like how many other cases are there like that in slightly different flavors, slightly different forms that continue, like you said, like that chasm is very much there. And it's like, I guess maybe the question is like, how is the chasm, like, what does that look like? Right. And like, how do you sort of bridge that? It's not just like, oh, like wage inequality.
Yeah.
Right. That's very like explicit. It's easily measured. Like, can we do something about it? It's like at the business school here, I remember like several years ago, there was like all of a sudden, all these women faculty got raises so that they could be like more parity. Now that's solving one problem and that's great. But like, that's very different from solving the problem that you're talking about. Right. Which I think is.
Well, and look, I mean, there's been a viral thread on Reddit about the number of women or threads leaving Microsoft. And because middle-aged women have had enough and we're kind of done with a lot of it and we're leaving the workforce in droves. And somebody slipped into my DMs. She's MIT, Fortune 50, like on all of these, she's very well known in the industry. She slipped into my DMs and said that she was up for a very senior job at Microsoft. And one of the senior executives told her privately that, oh, you're going to get the job just because you're a DEI hire. And she was like, you know what? Like, no, I earned it. Right. Like it's a real problem and we're not talking about it enough. So anyway, Matt, that's the answer. And again, it isn't about not thinking men are great because my job and my life would not be possible without men. So that's the irony.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting sort of flip side. Yeah.
How I'm curious, and this is another question that I've always wanted to ask you this question. So, and maybe this will help first because I don't know if Julia knows about this, and certainly some of the people watching aren't going to know this. Could you just give super high level background of the future self work that you've done?
Oh yeah.
And where I want to go with this is I actually want to talk about this future self understanding we have individually versus either organizationally or as groups, because I think that's kind of embedded in everything Julia's talking about here.
Yeah.
And I'm really, really curious how you break this down. So maybe tell us about the future self research first, so we can start there.
No, that's great. And I'm going to be so curious to see where both you guys take it on a collective. So the research that I've been involved in for like over 15 years now is, the starting point was why is it so hard for people to think about the long-term future when it comes to some, on a basic level, saving and spending decisions, but then on a more nuanced level, decisions like how do I allocate how do I make ethical decisions? How do I make decisions about my health? How do I allocate my time in ways that balance out what I want to do right now versus what might be good for the long run? And a lot of my work sort of boils down to this idea that our future selves are thought of as if they're other people, and on an emotional level, right? And the meaning behind that is that if we fail to connect emotionally to our future self, it's going to be very hard to do things today that will put our future selves in a good position. I don't mean that in a really basic, like don't spend or save, like that's part of it, but it goes so much deeper than that. How do I spend my time with my relationships, my kids and my spouse or my close friends versus work? These sorts of trade-offs, any of these trade-offs involve these sort of, push pulls between who I am now and who I eventually want to be. So much of my work really all of my work has focused on the individual. It's been about how I see myself now versus how I see myself later and how that impacts my decisions. The question that I think you're hinting at, Matt, is, well, no, maybe should I turn it back to you? I don't know if you wanted to take that question.
Just give us this question. Oh, actually, Julia, any questions? Because like you've done this. This is the great part about why I wanted the two of you on this conversation. Julia spent, what was it, 10 years ago that you wrote the digital transformation piece?
14, it was 13, 12 or 13 years ago. Yeah.
You want to just say what that was, high level too?
Yeah. Oh, just real quick, Hal. It isn't, but I also want to respond on a personal level to what Hal just said.
Please.
Hal, I wrote what was called the future of advice for wealth management, what was going to happen in the future. And I wrote it like 14 years ago, and almost everything about it has come true. And it was a completely contrarian view to what all the money that was being plowed into robo at the time. So that's what Matt is talking about. But what I wanted to say from a personal level is that when I was 44, I was managing 500 people in 13 states. And I thought that I would forever want to be a big executive who traveled around on a plane and got more and more and more power. If only I'd been able to tell my current 54-year-old self that I couldn't have cared less about any of that shit at 54, that I would have saved a lot more money and I would have put my ego in a box a lot sooner, because what I wanted at 44 is completely different than what I want at 54. And so Hal, I'm going to go buy your books and forever worship at your feet and wish I had listened to you 10 years ago. All right.
It's so interesting. Matt, I know it's like we're going in different, there's like, what were the Russian dolls with, there's like layers of this conversation here, right? I just want to respond to one thing, which is this is in my research, actually. It's Dan Gilbert and Jordi Klobach. This is a Harvard psychologist. They call it the end of history illusion. And it's this idea that we think, it's exactly what you said. It's this idea that we think we're fully baked now. Like, I know that I've changed from the past to the present, but now is who I am. And it's very hard for us to imagine changing into the future. And there's almost something that's unfair about that to our future selves, because it means that we might like do something now and lock ourselves in a position later on that we regret. And the reality is, and here's where what you said is so like, I'm getting so excited by it. The reality is, we change as much from 34 to 44 to 44 to 54, 54 to 64. And in fact, Dan Gilbert, the psychologist behind this, who's incredible. And Julia, you may remember him. He was, when Prudential did all those ads during the Super Bowl, this was probably 10 years ago. He was the psychologist in those ads when they, it'd say like,
how
think
funny.
of somebody. I don't know if you remember this is like ages ago. He was 64 when I interviewed him. And
Wow.
He said, and this is only a couple of years ago. And he said, I did this research, and he said, I never would have believed that I changed just as much from 54 to 64 as I did from 44 to 54.
Wow.
And he said things you can't anticipate, like grandkids for him. And, I forget, like stepping back on some research, whatever the case was. I don't even remember the details. These things we can't anticipate. And it's so interesting because we do change and we don't see it. So we don't think we're going to want it.
We don't predict it, right? I mean, I sincerely thought that I would just want more and more and more power, relevance, money, right? And all of these things. And then you get there and you're like, oh my God, this is not what I wanted. And I would never have anticipated that. Never at 44.
So interesting.
Hal, is there anything that you've either started to think about? And it's okay if it's curious too, because just like organizationally, or like, this is a flash mob of Russian dolls at this point in this conversation. So in this flash mob of Russian dolls, they're all dancing. There's all these layers involved.
That's cool.
Do we have any way of thinking about this, like culturally or in groups?
So yes, there's a couple of things. One is, I'm forgetting his name, but there's a researcher in Japan who's done this fascinating stuff where he's tried to get people to think about not future selves, but future groups. And he basically has people, if you think about any policy decisions, and you'll see the relevance to organizations right away. Oftentimes policymakers are making decisions that don't just impact their constituents now and in the next couple of years, but some of these decisions have impacts generations to come. And there's something what an incredible amount of power to make a decision now for a generation or two to come. The things that we do now will have these impacts on them and they have no voice. And this researcher in Japan has done this work where he essentially has people, they get in a room and they make policy decisions, but then half of them leave the room and they come back and there's something ridiculous about this, but I love it. They're in future clothes and they're like future clothes. I have quotes around it and they're meant to represent the future generations. And then they have a conversation with the people in the room who are making the decisions. And they're basically saying, oh, here's how that will impact me. And it's the same thing in theory, as if we just said, what would the impact be on a future generation? But the difference is this sort of exercise forces people to actually step into the shoes of future generations, future groups, and think about what the world will look like through their eyes as a function of the decisions that happen now. And so then you start saying, well, in what ways could this be done in an organizational setting? And there's a big, giant caveat that needs to be said here, which is so many organizations are beholden to short-term goals, to quarterly thinking. And I love, Julia, I love that you wrote that future advice. I didn't know about that. Like I do work with financial services firm, but I'm not in that space. And so it's like, I love learning this. You are able to step out of the quarterly mindset and think about what's to come, right?
Well, and look, I did it again with my Gen Z disruption work because the thing, Hal, I'm curious about is to what extent are people understanding the role of haptic memory in all of this? So my thing with stepping into the future is, your haptics are formed when you're 2 or 3 years old, and then it stays with you until you die. And those haptics, right? Gen Z is the first generation with primary haptic memory of a smartphone. Yeah. And my thing is to imagine the degree to which they're going to change the future because they grew up, right, with Angry Birds on their mama's phone, touching and seeing and feeling all of these things that they expect now from the world. And so I was saying 10 years ago, you have to be paying attention to that because those people will grow up. They will control the money and the processes and the future. And they're not going to tolerate all of this friction in financial services. That was the basis of my stuff. But I just don't think that very many people are very much paying attention to the role haptics plays in kind of how the future changes.
So interesting. And it's so true. I think about what are the generational sort of markers that you're talking about haptics, or you could say, you're using that as you're being Are you being literal about that?
I'm being literal and sort of figurative, right? But right, it's touch, feel, sensory.
Yeah.
And I just knew that that the financial services industry was definitely not paying attention to the fact that Gen Z would eventually grow up and not tolerate all of the backwards friction in processes, right? Because they're everywhere. The investment bank that I was talking to told me that they are still opening accounts by the sneaker brigade. So it goes into a digital front end and then it passes to operations people who put it in by hand. And that's everywhere on the street. And nobody wants to talk about that because everybody wants to pursue AI and all this sexy stuff. But all of the friction is still there, and they're not paying attention to, I think, the fact that Gen Z is not going to tolerate it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's like a really, what I love about that is that it's a very practical way of thinking about sort of generational psychology differences, right? It's funny. My kids are probably about 10 years behind your kids, like they're 5 and 8. And we just have the 2, but the other day we're thinking about how, and this is probably beyond your kids' age. Matt, you have kids too? I can't remember.
No.
Okay, so like Bluey is the show that everybody watches right now. I don't know if you guys have heard of Bluey at all, but it's like, Matt, you've heard of it, and it's like,
I'm a story nerd. I'm required to know about these things.
Okay, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's had like a billion downloads. It's unbelievable, or more probably, and it's cartoon dogs. This is going to become relevant to what you're talking about in a second, but it's an Australian show. It's sponsored by the Australian state. It's fascinating because it's a family. It's a traditional family in that it's, to a mom and dad and 2 kids, but they're dogs. And the dad is like the primary caretaker. So this is where it becomes non-traditional. And the mom isn't. And the dad is this incredibly like empathetic and fun and present. And it's like the experience I get watching it is like, oh God, like I wish I could be more like the dad, this cartoon dog dad. But my kids watch this. It's like the thing they watch when they're sick, the thing they watch when like we give them a half hour and I'm like, we're trying to work out or whatever. It's like, and it's true for all kids this age, this window of time. And I was thinking about like when they get older and they go off to college, this will be something that they bond with over their friends. Something will come up. Somebody will sing the Bluey theme song and it'll be like that shared cultural generational memory. And I've been thinking about like, what other markers are there like that? What are the other things that, I don't know if they're considered Gen Alpha or whatever it is, that like are shaping their perceptions of the world? But where I haven't gone is like, I've just been like, oh, it'll be interesting to see how they talk about that later. What you're talking about is like, how do those experiences then change what those kids who will eventually become adult consumers want from industries that have been around far longer than they have and will continue to be.
100%. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have said is, for sure, my kids who grew up with the dad, my husband took a step back in his career and is the squishy, like in a sweet way, like they go to him for warm and fuzzies and they stay away from mom at all times because I have very little empathy. And I'm and zero woo. So like they will not tolerate going to work at a company that does not respect women in a very real way. Like my kids know that I'm the boss. And so one of the things I've been screaming from a microphone is, corporations have to figure out how to respect and put women at the forefront in a way that is sincere, because the next generation isn't going to tolerate it. And they're not going to tolerate it, Hal, partly because of Bluey. God bless.
Yeah. By the way, you have like, I've watched them without the kids. They're 7 minutes long. This is a total aside, but like, and there's these subtle messages for the parents, like there was an episode, this is off topic, Matt, but like, I just wanted to say it just because I think it does speak to what you're talking about. Like, there was an episode where the kids are pretending to be the parents before they're like dressing up and like they have a balloon and the one little kid puts a balloon in her and she's like pretending to be the mom that's pregnant and the balloon pops and instantly, and it's this very subtle thing, the parents don't comfort the little kid. The dad looks over and holds the mom's hand. And it was like watching this, I instantly was like, they had a miscarriage. These cartoon dogs had a miscarriage. And I was like, am I going crazy? And I said it to my wife and she was like, no, I think that's right. And I went on Reddit and everyone's like, the miscarriage episode. And it's like the subtlest thing. And no kid would ever pick up on that. They're like, her balloon popped and she's sad. And it's like, oh my God, it's like speaking to this thing that nobody talks about, but it's such a problem. And it's like, I remember thinking like, this is wild. And like that they're talking about this to kids, like, what will that, like, what are the ripple effects of that later on? Anyway.
Okay, wait, I'm interrupting because no, I have a question specifically about the Bluey thing. And I'm excited because my brother and his wife and their kids, I talk about this with them. Is Bluey simultaneously rewiring and recoding your generation at the same time as the kids? Is there like a layer of this cultural shift because we don't have that moment?
Right.
A very different version of that moment happens on The Simpsons. And then if you're watching The Simpsons with your parents or whatever, I was like, and like that didn't exist a generation above because the kids weren't watching MASH with mom and dad or whatever. Right. So like, this is the first generation of parents co-watching a show or movies. I think of all like my wife and I just went to see Inside Out 2 the other week because we were obsessed with the first. So we were like, we'll sit with the parents and the little children because we need to see this too. So are those shared experiences actually shaping the organizations and the cultures? I feel like they are. I feel like there's no way they're not. What do you think about that?
I think they are, but I also think it's bidirectional. Like, I think, who's creating these shows? And it's, I mean, this is like a broader concept of, conversation about art, but it's like, it's reflecting society too, right? And it's creating it at the same time. I would have to think, but you're absolutely right. You think about like kids shows. Mr. Rogers was emotionally astute and intelligent, but it was for kids. There wasn't a layer for parents too. And this had that. This is the new thing, I think, to have that.
Julia, what do you think about this? And are there ways that we can actually kind of like coach or guide two generations at the same time? Is this reasonable or is this insane?
Oh, listen, now we're going into like, oh boy, gentlemen, let me tell you that, hopefully some family offices are listening to this and they want to hire me for a consulting gig. I have been saying for 10 years that all of this wealth that is created by, these legacy businesses where it's like the family business is everything and mom and dad are obsessed with their jobs and the kids just get the money and they're pushed off to the side and then they grow up without a purpose-driven life. I've been saying you need to take those teenagers and ask them what you should be doing to modernize the family business to keep it relevant. And you should be listening to those teenagers because those teenagers have something to offer you about what digital transformation looks like. And I'm reminded of a dairy business in Pennsylvania that does $1 million cash business every week. Okay. And they are still paper-based. They are, all writing receipts by hand and then delivering $1 million to the bank in cash. I mean, I'm serious. And they have a teenage son who is very disaffected. And I had the courage to tell the father, you know what? A way to involve your son and make him feel seen and heard is to ask him what you should be doing to digitize your business because you think you're going to be fat and happy with this business forever. These cash receipts cannot last forever. Go do something to engage that child and give them a purpose. It gives me goosebumps every time. So Matt, I absolutely believe both generations should be informing each other. I would be making a mistake if I was not listening to my 18-year-old son. He is so wise and profound. I mean, he's also a pain in the ass too, but like he is wise and profound and he has things to say. And I think it has been a huge miss by the baby boomer generation, to push aside Gen X and not listen. Millennials dismiss us, not give it, make jokes about the fact that they're lazy or whatever. Like we have to be accountable for kind of how those generations show up. And I absolutely think everyone who owns a very profitable family business should be tapping the next generation for how they think. Because remember, those kids are watching everything about what's going on with that business, whether you know it or not, because the parents, it's all they talk about, right? So they know more than you think. obviously I have a huge amount of passion for this subject. Sorry.
I also think that's part of what you're talking about is so interesting because it also flips ageism on its head.
100%.
I have a colleague and buddy named Mike North who's at NYU. He like cut his teeth doing work on ageism in the traditional way. But like looking at when is it that people want to push aside older folks and when they are okay with them. And, his work shows nuance. It's not that we're just ageist. We're ageist when we think that older people are taking up our space. But recently he's been looking at, call it like flipped ageism when older generations are dismissive of the younger ones. And it's exactly what you're talking about. And it's like, it's not only problematic for the sake of it being problematic, but it's problematic from the sake that you've missed out on expanding the pie and creating more value. Your example is a perfect example of like, you could dismiss that 18-year-old kid or that 16-year-old kid or involve him, create more value in the future and give more purpose to him. And at the same time, make your business better, right? Like what an amazing win-win-win of sorts, right?
Right. And then, I think make you relevant, right? Like if I just sat here, just deciding that I knew everything, I would be the most uninteresting 54-year-old person that I've ever met in my life. And instead I choose to try to be interesting because I have an open mind.
Yeah. That's great.
Tie this back, I guess maybe back to the individual level, Hal, like so your dad at the dairy farm and you got the kid and you're doing all your cash receipts and whatever else. What in the future self stuff, how can you say like, think forward?
Yeah.
How can you guide somebody to play this forward? What advice would you give in that situation?
This is one of these spaces where I'm curious and I say curious deliberately because I don't know the answer. I'm curious what extent legacy motives might impact someone in this case. And what I mean by that is, let's take the most recent example. I have no idea what the conversations behind closed doors with Joe Biden were, but I'm curious, for his decision to step down. Right. And I'm very curious to what extent the like legacy conversation played in, because undoubtedly by stepping down, he has solidified a version of his legacy that I think would surely be tarnished had he continued to run. Yeah. And I know I'm saying this probably from one political perspective, but like, that aside, that's gotta be a very strong motivator. And I'm curious, the dairy farm dad, it's like the dairy company dad, you could argue that he's thinking of his future self and that he's amassing wealth for him. Maybe he's even amassing wealth for the next generation. Right. But then there's another version of it, which is like, there's amassing wealth. And then there's also keeping the business in the family. And there's, creating, multi-generational wealth. Right. And those are the things that really boil down to legacy and like, how will you be remembered? And this very simple thing of, digital transformation and involving your Gen Z son or millennial son or whatever it is, like, is a practical way to get at that, in my words.
Well, and Hal, think about this, and Matt, think about this. I spent my entire career working with high net worth and ultra high net worth families. The other thing that you potentially prevent is for that son to grow up disaffected and then becoming a drug addict. I mean, right. I remember being on the phone with two brothers who had inherited a lot of money, and the older brother, my iPad does all kinds of crazy things when I'm using my hands. So sorry.
Got the message. Drug addiction, send the balloons up.
I'm sorry. It was so inappropriate.
Perfect timing.
So, the brother that grew up with like no purpose it could have been how potentially prevented if this child always feels ignored and dismissed and instead starts to become involved. You're potentially saving both future selves.
Yeah.
And that's the part I don't think many people step outside themselves to think about.
That's so interesting. And you're talking about purpose and meaning and fuzzy concepts that are not necessarily always talked about in the financial advice and wealth management profession, but at the same time, they have to be, right? And, there's great empirical research. Grant Donnelly, Mike Norton did this paper looking at happiness among millionaires. we can look at that. What's the link between happiness and wealth? And you can only look at a certain segment of the population, and they were able to get a segment of actual, high net worth, ultra high net worth individuals. And one of the things that they found was that the way that people got their money mattered for happiness. If they worked for it, they were happier than if they just strictly inherited it. Now, this kid we're talking about, boy, we had no idea that this dairy farm example would get so much airtime here. But like this kid, he's going to inherit that money. But if he's part of that process, he's going to also feel like he worked for it.
Yep.
And like you said, what impact will that have down the line? Yes.
It's so interesting. And Julia, I'm wondering if you have anything else to add to this. Like solving it at multiple levels feels like it really truly requires shared purpose, or else it just gets backburnered. And until you laser in on the part of the conversation where you're like, what is some Venn diagram of overlapping purpose between the two of you that you both care enough about taking a step forward together, as opposed to a step forward in like two different directions?
Well, look, I mean, I'm the least smartest person here. But I feel like as a child, in this particular example, right, with your own kids, you have a window to connect. And then just the work that I've seen, at some point, you lose that window closes. So your shared purpose goes away because you're just too far apart. The chasm is too deep. And so the thing is like, what's so amazing to me about how long I've been thinking about this whole generational and use your kids to help keep your business relevant. The thing that makes me the saddest about it is that it's just, Hal, to your point, such a win-win for everyone.
Exactly.
Right? And it doesn't matter if ultimately that 16-year-old grows up and decides he wants to be a lawyer. He will always remember that his dad had him genuinely involved in the dad's business,
right,
and that the dad genuinely cared to hear him. And I think that's just really sad as to how much adults get so stuck in our ways. And so stuck, Hal, believing that we're never going to be a different person. Like I always thought I would be this ambitious person who's wanted more and more and more and more and more. And so like you just, it to me, Matt, it's just such a win-win that's so obvious, and yet so few, right, lean into it.
Yeah.
At least in my experience.
Is there anything else within that, Hal, just on like the win-win? I don't know if we're familiar with the expression win-win, but that's the variation of it. Instead of worrying about the two sides winning together, it's both sides saying, when are we going to win? As opposed to just the mutually
that's
accepted
great
larger purpose. That's a really cool body of literature on that stuff too. But is there anything else about just like the psychology of the win-win? Just even, how do you even define it?
It's interesting. Early in my career, I used to teach negotiations. That was like how I started. And, the first thing you teach in that class is about value creation and understanding what the other person wants. And, everybody who teaches negotiation talks about the example of the two sisters who both want the orange and they cut it in half. And then the one realizes that the other just wants the juice and the other one wants the rind. And it's like, you could have created more value and expanded the pie had you just asked what it is that you wanted. Right. And this is like the classic example, but I can't help but think that, this sort of intergenerational conversation, it's not your traditional negotiation, but it shares features of negotiations in that you have different sides that may have both competing and aligned interests. And, how you go about having those conversations could bring out more value creation and pie expanding opportunities.
Julie, do you know about the orange? Did you ever?
No, I don't.
Orange?
But you know what? I'm just laughing here because I am the worst negotiator. So I just wish that I had been sitting in Hal's class when he was teaching that.
Whoa,
I really am the worst.
Wait. I refuse. I reject your proposition as worst negotiator. Do you know how few people are willing to walk away from a table? Like you started this conversation telling us.
You're right. I did walk away. Okay, well, I did, but here's why I can't talk about this part. I could have walked away with more than I did, but I let my bad temper get in the way. So I wish I had known Hal and had him on my speed dial before I did that. Okay, let's just leave it at that.
I'm not going to let you accept worst negotiator, everybody. I'm going to say at least you know Hal for this. I took a bunch of notes. I'm going to read back some of these notes from this conversation, and I'm fully inviting you to just interrupt me at will as I read back some of this stuff, because this has been such a cool conversation. You guys above and beyond delivered on this. This is great. Julia, you started off at the beginning talking about this idea that you can always go back, that you're building this bridge, and that you can never, ever underestimate what you can learn. And God, that's a beautiful statement. Just a reminder that you can never underestimate what you can learn. You followed it up. You were on fire at the beginning of this conversation. You talked about, I wrote it down this way. It's like, there's the big quit, there's the big commit, and there's the big pivot.
I love this. Oh my God. I'm writing a LinkedIn post about it right now. I'm going to use that.
That's fantastic.
It's yours. The big quit, the big commit, the big pivot.
That's amazing.
You wouldn't be where you were if you didn't take what you perceive as a misstep now, which doesn't mean it's like the missed step and the misstep are two different things. Like we almost need different words to divide these different paths that we take on.
Yeah.
How you talked about the goal pursuit, and say the name of it again. We were talking about how a step closer can simultaneously feel like a step further. What's the name of the you that you mentioned? You brought up a specific name, I think.
I think some people call it like the goal gradient. I don't know if goal gradient hypothesis is quite right, but there's some work on that. I don't know if there's an exact name for it.
If we figure it out or you remember, send me it. We'll put it in the notes.
I thought it was the big U. It's not the big U. Okay, well, I like that.
I think there's
big U sounds good to me.
The big U. We've coined it right here today.
I love that.
Carreon Hershfield, big U. Which is officially
I love it.
There we go. Okay. Julia, I love the frankness and just the menopause conversation, because it's one of those things that it still almost feels taboo. It's like a thing we don't talk about at all. And it's weird that it's taboo, I guess is my point. And you're reminding me of it both in the work that you were talking about on LinkedIn and other places the last few months, but then certainly in this conversation, just why does that feel taboo? But what I really, really loved inside of this that you were explaining is safety comes from being on that mission. And it goes back to that misstep thing. Like the safety on the mission is, yes, attacking the patriarchy and all that stuff. We're trying to change things from the inside out. But it's like knowing that you're on the mission means even the misstep can be self-corrective, because there's that sense of direction of what you're staring at on the horizon. That's a really profound reminder. And it doesn't have to be something so big. It can be something as small as just like, no, I'm just doing this because I think it's fair. That you can't write a flag, can't raise a flag that says fair. Like that's not exciting. That doesn't rally anybody behind it. But that's kind of, you're just like, no, fair is the guiding force here.
That's it. I actually got a tattoo. I got my first tattoo when I was 30 and now I have 7. But I got my first tattoo at 30 and it says fair. So that's kind of been a guiding principle for me.
Cool.
That is amazing. Hal, you talked about explicit versus implicit attitudes and then evidence, and sort of fascinated by this idea beyond the scope of this conversation, but just explicit problems with implicit solutions as opposed to implicit problems with explicit solutions.
Yeah, that's cool.
I feel like we flip those things constantly. I hadn't ever thought about that before. So
that's great.
Thank you for this. I got to bring this up too. You segued that into talking about sort of this long run versus present tense, your future self work. I've been writing and thinking a lot about, actually as it relates to the brat thing and Kamala and all this stuff with Charlie XCX, the narcissist. Did you ever relate any of the future self stuff to narcissists? Did that ever happen?
Did you
dive back into Ovid lately?
What did you say?
Did you dive back into your Ovid lately? You got metamorphosis on the desktop somewhere?
I haven't. It's a really interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
So look up narcissist, look up the prophecy versus the curse I think this is a fascinating thing that exists because this prophecy that he can only live if he learns to love himself. But then he gets cursed later. And the curse is that whoever loves you won't love you back. And that becomes the separation of self when he perceives himself in the water is different from his actual self.
Oh, that's fascinating. I don't think I knew. I didn't know that, like the original, the OG narcissist story.
The OG narcissist story is wild. I'll send you something on that. 54-year-old Julia thinks 44-year-old Julia doesn't know shit. I mean, just hang that in the Louvre. That was fantastic.
Yeah. No, that's true.
The end of history illusion as it relates to it. And because I know I got to get us out of here, I got to say this whole legacy motives thing at the end and pairing up purpose with sharing the future selves in community. And as we think about the legacy, not just of one generation, but the legacy behind it, holy crap, everybody take that to work. Take it to work with the Bluey episodes. Take it to work with talking about the patriarchy, of getting these awkward conversations on the table. I want to thank you both so much for this conversation. We went in directions I never thought we would. Hal, go first. Tell the people, where can they find you if they want to learn more?
Yeah. First off, thank you, Matt, for having this conversation and for introducing me to Julia. Julia, was so cool to meet you and talk to you. I can't wait to keep it going. HalHershfield.com is where you can find all my stuff and my, we talked about some of the topics in my book, but that's called Your Future Self. And that's, Amazon, wherever you want to buy books.
Julia, what about you? What's the best place for people to find and connect with you these days?
Well, look, I'm building my website for my future self. Hal, thank you. And you can find me on LinkedIn for now. And I just want to say I am totally inspired, Matt, by you and the work that you do, and the generosity of your spirit. It comes out to everybody who interacts with you. You are so gracious. You are so giving. And I have no reason to kiss your ass except for that it's genuine, because I am not known for being, an ass kisser. So anyway, sorry if you have to edit that out. But and Hal, you've been absolutely delightful, and it's been my pleasure to be here. I really had the best hour, honestly.
This was great.
You're watching Just Press Record. This is the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, comment below. Keep sending me good, gracious people. I love introducing people who don't know each other in this format. If I can do this, anybody can do this. Put some more good into the world. That's your future self. Thank you both for joining me. Talk to you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below. The Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Ziegler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out. Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below. The Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Ziegler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.